Hello and welcome to the big picture. India has been pursuing the Look East policy for some years now. As part of this policy, India has been engaging the ASEAN countries as well as countries in South Asia like Bangladesh. India's Foreign Minister S.M. Krishna is right now in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, attending the open session of the 10th ASEAN-India ministerial meeting. These engagements with the ASEAN nations have assumed more importance as it is the key cornerstone of India's foreign policy, as Krishna has stated in Phnom Penh today. Meanwhile, one of the founders of ASEAN, Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, is on a 3-day visit to India now and is meeting several business and political leaders, including the Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. Today, we will look at how India's Look East policy is evolving and whether it has been able to realize its potential as envisaged, and what are the roadblocks, if any, in this pursuit. To discuss this, I have with me today S.Nihal Singh, veteran journalist and editor who has worked in the ASEAN region for several years and knows it intimately. Rajiv Sikri, former Secretary East, Ministry of External Affairs. Prof.Baladas Ghoshal, Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, and Pramit Chaudhuri, Foreign Affairs Editor, Hindustan Times. Welcome to all of you. First, let me go to Mr. Nihal Singh. You have worked in those regions for several years. You know those areas intimately. Do you see, when you were working in those regions and now, do you see a major shift in the way these countries look at India?
Well, I think the shift has been coming for some years now,
Yes.
and the shift is obvious because they feel the presence of China, which is very weighty in every sense of the word, and they are looking for friends outside of China.
Right.
India is an obvious candidate. Unfortunately, I think from their point of view, they've been rather disappointed, at least in the earlier phase, because they thought India would play a much more active role than it did. Secondly, of course, they are very gratified to notice the American role, the new American role, the announcement of US policy in terms of the pivot towards Asia. I think they stopped using that word, but the emphasis being on the Indo-Pacific, as they call it.
Right.
I think there is very great potential for India there. India has not fulfilled its potential, in my view, and I think much more needs to be done in terms of an active foreign policy phase in relation to these countries. They are pining for India, in my view.
Mr. Sikri, Mr. Nihal Singh says that they are disappointed. They don't, we have not done as much as they expected us to do, and you were there as Secretary East. When you were there, or even when you look at things now, do you agree with what Mr. Nihal Singh is saying?
I would broadly agree with him. I think that while India has over the last decade done a lot with these countries compared to the preceding years, after all, it is now 10 years since the practice of a summit level meeting every year began. And I was dealing with this matter when the process started. We were not quite sure how the ASEAN would react, whether we would get an annual summit or not. The key factor was our then Prime Minister Vajpayee's bold initiative to offer an FTA, a free trade agreement, that convinced them that we were serious about this matter. Then the open skies policy. Initially, they were a bit reluctant on security and terrorism issues, but after the Bali bombings, they came on board. And now you find that in the last 5 or 6 years, the defense and security component of our relationship with all these countries has expanded greatly. We have invested there. There's a lot more people-to-people exchanges. We have about $80 billion of trade. All that is doing very well. But in comparative terms, India lags behind the big boys there like China or Japan or South Korea or the United States. It's a function of the size of our economy. It's also a function of the way things work in India. Yes, there is a certain bit of disappointment, but I think also that our focus on the East lost a little bit of dynamism in the years that we were focused on the nuclear deal and relations with USA.
US.
Now I think the focus is coming back on this region, particularly as we all know and recognize that the geopolitics of the world in the coming decades is going to be centered in this
In
region.
this region. Professor Ghoshal, China, as Mr. Nihal Singh was pointing out, these countries look at India to, counterbalance the Chinese influence. Is it something which India is also looking forward to?
I think India is quite hesitant to do that.
Exactly.
I think I would agree with them, the earlier two speakers, but there is one area, I think if India has to play an important role in that region, which the region expects it to do, it has to offer something new, a niche. Say China has been doing quite a lot.
Right.
Chiang Mai Initiative, ASEAN Plus 3, many of those initiatives were actually taken up by China. India, apart from the fact that in 2003, I think India signed that Treaty of Amity and Peace and Cooperation, which was really appreciated by the Southeast Asian countries. Apart from that, afterwards, India did not really do much in terms of providing anything in terms of the kind of engagement or setting the agenda. Now, even in terms of its responsibilities or playing greater role, I think the recent withdrawal from Vietnam has given it a kind of a sort of an indication that India is really weak in terms of facing China in the region.
Pramit, in fact, yesterday, soon after this meeting, China has issued a warning to these ASEAN nations that, as far as South China Sea is concerned, please keep off. Don't try to be so hyperactive.
Yeah, well, I think that is...
No, is that the reason why India is hesitant? China is very aggressive on this issue.
Well, the South China Sea, I think, keep in mind that this is a part of the world that is at the limits, if you wish, of Indian military and political influence. This is very far away. We don't have any standing assets, military or otherwise, in the South China Sea. What we do have is good relationships,
right,
particularly with Vietnam, which have been accelerating quite rapidly. And we have stood by the principle of freedom of navigation of the seas. We saw a very strong statement by Defense Minister Antony at the Shangri-La conference recently in Singapore. But our ability to actually extend military support into that area is very difficult. If you look at a map and you see where our Navy is, the Straits of Malacca is really the limits to where we go, which is why a lot of the countries there, including the Vietnamese, are turning to America for the military backing. But they're still prepared to see India as a country that could potentially contribute not only diplomatically, but potentially militarily sometime in the future, which is one of the reasons why the Vietnamese have been talking to us on maritime, on certain other military issues that they'd be interested in.
Mr. Sikri, was this exercise, South China, India going to South China Sea and then withdrawing from that, how do you look at this?
Well,
was it a misadventure?
No. I think we have been in Vietnam for more than a decade now. And it is quite possible that the reason that has been given out that this is not commercially viable is the right one. We don't have to see a sinister motive behind it all.
Everybody sees it.
Well, that's another thing. But I think Pramit's point is well taken, that at one level we want to be assertive about our right for freedom of navigation there. At another level, I think we have a much bigger game to play with China. And we have to pick our fights with China, not on every issue.
Selectively.
We may not be able to be there, have our defense forces there, but we can enhance the defense capability of many of these countries. And we have some assets and capabilities which these countries are looking for. It's the way China does with Pakistan. It doesn't have a military presence there, but it does a lot to enhance and it gives Pakistan the confidence. Similarly, we can give the confidence to these countries that, we are there. And in fact, we actually have huge stakes because about 50 or 60% of our trade with the whole world passes through this region. If you take ASEAN, Australia, East Asia and so forth, it's a lot of trade. So when Mr. Antony emphasizes the importance of the principle of the freedom of navigation, it's not just China baiting, it's also our national interests.
Mr. Nihal Singh?
Well, I think we have been in Vietnam for more than a decade now. And it is quite possible that the reason that has been given out that this is not commercially viable is the right one. We don't have to see a sinister motive behind it all. Everybody sees it.
Mr. Nihal Singh?
Well, I think I would agree broadly with what Mr. Sikri has said, but the point is I think we need to be a little more energetic and proactive, not in terms of picking up fights with China, but in terms of expressing our policy values, our approach to the whole region, our great interest in it, and spell it out that this is a legitimate interest of India, which I don't think we have done clearly enough to my mind.
We will continue this discussion. We need to go into a short break now. Please keep watching. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. We are discussing the ASEAN-India relations. Professor Ghoshal, Mr. Nihal Singh was talking about the U.S. presence there and how these countries are looking up to the U.S. Do you see a convergence of interest of India and U.S. in this region?
There are convergences as well as divergences. Convergences in terms of freedom of navigation,
Right.
Peaceful resolution of conflicts. But I think there are also differences. For example, India had insisted that it has to be settled bilaterally, some of these disputes, whereas United States has emphasized that it has to be multilateral, which is also the attitude of the ASEAN countries as well. And apart from that,
in fact, in this whole South China business, that's what China is saying, that South China Sea business, China is saying that this should not be discussed at the multilateral forum, that individually we will discuss it.
But the position of most of the ASEAN countries is that it has to be done multilaterally,
Right.
except of course the three states, Myanmar, Laos and Cambodia.
Right.
The rest of the other countries are actually in favor of a more multilateral approach because they know that, vis-a-vis China, an individual country is rather weak and China can really force its position on this. Now, apart from all this, I think there is also a certain element of skepticism about the American role in the region. While they have been really demanding that America should increase its involvement in the region, and they also want India also to be present in the region, but at the same time, I think the economic crisis in the United States and many of the news that are flowing into the country in most of the Southeast Asian countries gives them also a certain element of skepticism. And secondly, they know that they will have to really live with China. China is the neighbor, whereas United States is far away. Even with all its might, in case there is some trouble really, United States is not going to really come in terms of supporting these countries. If something goes wrong, even in Tibet, I don't think United States is going to come and do anything. And that's why India itself is also quite hesitant to toe the American line. And I think Antony did show some reservations in some of its discussions with Panetta.
Okay. Pramit, the US role so India needs to do a very subtle balancing act when it comes to this region, and whether it should, as you were saying that US wants India to play there. So how have we been able to do that balancing act?
Well, I think keep in mind that while we're focusing a lot on the South China Sea in this conversation, ultimately that is not, in my view, the primary concern that
as far as India is concerned.
We're really more concerned about the Straits of Malacca and the points of entry into the Indian Ocean, because that's an area where we have independent power capacity. We are right now building 42 warships, which will make, and at the present rate of expansion, if we can maintain it, we will have one of the largest navies in the world, and easily the largest navy in the Indian Ocean, other than the United States itself. So if you look at the map, for us, Myanmar is now opened up in a way that it was not. We used to have a problem that we had a security policy, and then we had a democracy policy, which were clearly contradictory. We chose the security policy. Right now, that's no longer a contradiction, and it's very clear when the Prime Minister went to Myanmar this time, we can now operate on a whole set of fields which we could not do so before. Even a country like Malaysia, which has been traditionally quite skeptical of India, Mahathir Mohamad is famous for his abuse of us on a regular basis. They're looking at the Indian private sector because their economic model, in which they allowed Western multinationals to use labor arbitrage to survive and make Malaysia industrialize, that's collapsing because they're no longer a cheap labor country. And they don't have an indigenous entrepreneurial capacity of their own that matches ours. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to get Indian companies to move in where the West is leaving. Singapore, of course, has always been a very strong friend, and it's one of the few countries that we allow their troops and their aircraft to train on Indian soil. Right. And now we're having a strong relationship with Indonesia, which I would argue also didn't exist. It's one of our main naval partners. We're moving on a whole host of fronts with Indonesia. So if you look at that rim on the eastern coast fringe of the Indian Ocean, I would argue India is moving on several fronts quite rapidly, and a lot of it not necessarily on the government-to-government level, but as I said, the private sector, for example, is moving in on a scale that wasn't there before. If you go to places like Manipal University, it's packed with Malaysian and Indonesian students now. So on that area, I think we're doing quite well. South China Sea is, should we say, an extension, which, as I said, is limits to our power, but we could still
Professor
moving forward.
Goshal's point that there are certain divergences as far as India and the US's interests there are concerned.
There are, I would say, I would argue that strategically we don't have any major differences. The vision that we have, if you wish, for Southeast Asia is broadly the same as the United States. We have differences in terms of tactics. And part of the tactical difference is that our interests, as I said, are much more clustered around the Indian Ocean. South China Sea is a bit of a limit as far as an extension of our power and capacity. But I would argue that the United States doesn't see or has any real problems with India's extension of its influence in this area as a whole. It sees that generally as a positive sign.
Mr. Nihal Singh, this skepticism, here I think Professor Ghoshal was talking about, are there still countries in this region who are still skeptical about India?
Well, I think they are less skeptical, but there is an element of skepticism still there, you will find in different countries, because they feel that India doesn't come out boldly enough from their point of view.
Yes.
We have our own perspectives, of course. But I would like to add on the American theme.
Yes.
The problem is the old American-Indian problem, which is that they want us to be a camp follower, which is not on. They know it's not on. The policymakers know. But still you find voices in the Congress, in the Senate. They feel that after all they are doing India's duty partly, and India should come up and so on. And that's not going to happen because obviously it is not in our interest to do that to begin with. But there again, I would urge a stronger and more active phase of Indian diplomacy in terms of look-east policy, because look-east policy has drifted over the years or decades, since it was Narasimha Rao, I think, who announced it in the beginning. I think it has improved and there is a more active phase, but I would like to see more activists.
Mr.
Indian moves.
What
not in terms of belligerence.
No, not in belligerence, dynamism. He's talking of dynamism. Where is it? Why is it lacking? Or do you think it is lacking at all? Do you agree with him?
Well, I think the first decade was a bit of a washout, the 90s. It really started taking off after about 2000 or so. After the nuclear tests and the Indian economy started picking up, and the geopolitics changed, and the perspective, Indian perspective and on a strategic perspective changed. So I think it's been growing steadily, but the trouble is that it is in the last decade that China has grown phenomenally.
Yes.
So the relative growth of China and India has been very, very different. And China has been able to do much more in the region than we have been able. We just don't have those resources, and we have so many other problems to contend with. So yes, there has been a comparative slowing down of the Indian engagement with this region. In absolute terms, I would say no. But when you look at it in the broader picture, yes, the share of India, and And the Southeast Asian countries are a little disappointed. They want India to do more because they say, look, so much is happening there. Why aren't you more active? Now, that depends on what are the resources we can command to invest there, to go there, our businessmen. All those factors come into play. It's not just the government.
Pramit was talking about increasing engagement, not necessarily at the government level, at the private level. Yes.
I think that at the private level it has increased. Look at the tourism traffic, for example, and look at the business traffic. I remember that when we started the summits, there were very modest goals we had for trade. And today it is $80 billion. It was never thought of that we would reach $80 billion in 2011. But it has grown. So in that sense, it has grown better. Now, one of the factors which is holding back
the potential, what kind of potential do you see in terms of trade?
No, that's the point I was coming to, that we have signed the FTA on trade in goods, where the ASEAN have an advantage. But there is some services and investment where India has an advantage, and that ASEAN are dragging their feet on that, and we are a little unhappy over that. So it's not just that India is to blame. I think the ASEAN also are trying to get advantage and not give where they are a little weaker than we are.
Yeah, Professor Ghoshal.
I think I want to emphasize another interesting point in this discussion is that, no relationship can be sustained just on an intergovernmental level.
Absolutely.
It has to be supported by, civil society interactions, business interests and all that. Even tourism, except in one or two countries like Thailand and Malaysia, very little of Vietnam or Singapore for that matter.
Yes.
There is not much of traffic flow,
and
more from Indian side rather than from their side. I think we talk about India's look-east policy, but you don't do much in terms of creating a kind of an environment within the country. Look at the situation in India about the study of Southeast Asia. There are very little things that are done, very few experts with knowledge of the local language. There is not much knowledge about that region. Very few people know about the region itself. So I think if you really have to do something in Southeast Asia, one has to also do simultaneously certain other actions. The government has to be a little bit more proactive. And then finally another point, I think, our soft power. That has a tremendous appeal in the region, and
Absolutely.
to my mind, because I have lived in that region for many years, I have been traveling in that region for the last 45 years. The cultural elements,
Absolutely.
the kind of even tourism aspects on cultural areas, all these areas, if it could be exploited very subtly and intelligently, there can be tremendous opportunities. And even Myanmar,
Right.
Now we are trying to woke up to the situation in Myanmar. Even 10 years back, if you could have invested a little bit of 1/10 of the money that you have invested in Afghanistan, I think things would have been quite different in
Mr.
Myanmar.
Sikri?
Oh, I completely agree with him. I think that we should be giving Myanmar the kind of strategic attention that we give to Afghanistan. And the very point, we have invested $1.5 billion. Just half that sum of money in Myanmar would have given you 3 times the dividends. It's just that Myanmar is too far removed from the capital city, that Pakistan and Afghanistan figure unduly prominently in our national psyche, and we ignore this. Whereas Myanmar is a far more critical neighbor for us, because it is not only because it's an immediate neighbor and has so many opportunities for India, but also it's the land bridge to Southeast Asia.
Mr. Nihal Singh, the ASEAN countries talk about integration, their own integration, economic integration and other integration. Has India been doing anything to help them to integrate? So that, and is it in our interest that they integrate?
Well, I think they are integrating, but India has not done anything specific in relation to that. And I don't know whether they'd welcome it, because after all, India is an outside power, and they have their own internal dynamics, which is in favor of integration. And I think they're doing rather well in terms of when it was first mooted, that was in the 60s.
Right, 60s.
I was in the region,
Yes.
in Singapore.
Yes.
When
5 countries got together.
yes.
And
So they've come a long way, but I don't think they would welcome Indian or other outside intervention in getting integrated.
Mr.
I doubt
Sikri,
it.
yes?
I just want to add a point here. Actually, the situation has changed a little bit since Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar and Vietnam joined. And about 10 years ago, they started this initiative for ASEAN integration, which is trying to bring the newer members, these 4 newer members, up to the same level as the older members.
Absolutely.
And India has been very active in giving assistance to these countries, and they welcome it.
Yeah.
So capacity building and setting up institutions and training and so on. Soft power. No, yeah, soft power. All that is very welcome. They welcome it because it is resources which are going to uplift these countries so that they would be at a more level. And it serves our national interest also.
Absolutely. Just, Mr. Ghoshal, there has been an effort to create the South Asia nuclear-free zone. You know, but there seems to be some resistance from the 5 nuclear nations.
In fact, they wanted to have that document
Where
signed
does
in
India
this
stand
particular
in this?
meeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Southeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone.
Free zone.
Now, I think 4 of the states, nuclear weapon states, have resisted.
Right.
And they still have to discuss about it. United States have not shown any of their position right as yet.
Right.
But I think they also have reservations on that. In fact, you know, one point that I wanted to say is that Southeast Asian countries would have loved India to support their proposal. Now, whether we mean it or not, that's a different question altogether. The Chinese have supported their nuclear weapons free zone.
Right.
Being a nuclear weapon state, they have supported. But they know very well that Chinese don't mean it. But at least, they have given some support to it. And in fact, one of the Thai, very well-known intellectuals, in the last India-ASEAN dialogue, the New Delhi dialogue, he did mention this particular fact, that we really wanted that India should have at least given us some support on that issue.
Okay, Pramit, last words to you. You think India should have taken this opportunity to, as far as this nuclear-free zone issue is concerned, or you think it's better that India just stays away from it?
Well, I think India is still working out a fair number of issues about its own nuclear doctrine and policy. So I see that as an issue that we should address one day, but I don't think it's a priority for us right now. I think for us, as has been correctly mentioned, we need to get that second FTA deal done with ASEAN. We need to be able to extend some influence and some knowledge about ourselves to these further ASEAN countries. Philippines, for example, is still relatively if not hostile, indifferent to India. We need to work on that. Vietnam is changing, but Cambodia is a country, for example, which I think culturally very closely linked to us, but completely neglected.
Absolutely.
These are the things that we need to be addressing.
Okay, Mr. Sikri, last words. You think, wrapping it up, you think India is now on the right track as far as these nations are concerned? Do you think we will be able to realize our full potential in the coming years? How long will you think?
I think we are on the right track. I think we are giving the kind of attention that is due. We are involved in all the structures, the most important structures for cooperation in this region, be it the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting +8, the East Asia Summit, we're now of the ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting. So India is very much part of the inner core of partners of ASEAN. And I think that the ASEAN would welcome any initiative that we take to strengthen our presence and increase our cooperation.
We have completely run out of time. That said, it is from this discussion at least it's evident that the Look East policy which the Indian government adopted 20 years back is taking us somewhere. We need to keep a watch on these developments very closely. Thank you very much. Thanks to all my guests, Mr. S.Nihal Singh, Mr. Rajiv Sikri, Professor Ghoshal and Pramit Chaudhuri. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue on the big picture at the same time tomorrow.